Good morning, everyone. We're just going to go through, or I'm just going to go through a basic sort of tutorial on how to mock up some forms and shapes in Rhino. Obviously, all of you should sort of be at this point, but moving on, what we're going to do is export it to Vred, which is a program on the right here, and then we can look at how we're going to apply materials and can go about rendering it in Vred if we want to use that as an alternative to V-Ray, just because it's going to work better, maybe not better, but easier for us to work with than V-Ray, and it's always V-Ray, and it's always good to learn a new program. So we're going to be looking at exporting a form, shape, or a couple together as one assembly, putting it into Vred, applying materials, setting up a very basic sort of scene, and creating a render from that. Further on, we'll learn how to get some animations going and do some really cool stuff that's capable in Vred quite easily. So, basically in Rhino, I stated in class, CAD starts with sketches. So ideally you would have something like on the right plane, something from the front plane, and something from the top plane, so you know exactly what you're trying to model up. Unless of course you're going for something very exploratory. Right now I'm just going to draw up something weird and extrude it out, and we'll see how that goes. So let's just go with a polyline. So we've got a polyline here. You might notice that I'm using Rhino 5. That's just because I haven't been able to get access to Rhino 6, so you have more options when it comes to just pulling shapes out and extruding from here. But I will just extrude the curve and pull it out. Again, doesn't really matter. We can play around with different shadings, obviously. Let's just go with shaded for now. And what I want to do is, because this is made up of surface, we can round this out or rebuild our surface. So if we turn on our points, which is F10, we see that there's not really any points to work with on this surface. So we can rebuild, and we get an option for all these settings. So we can apply that, and now we have, where is it? It should have changed. Okay, for some reason I had to explode it because it was set as an extrusion and not as a surface. We didn't have this problem in the newer Rhino, extrudes it straight as a surface. So what I did was rebuild the surface. That allowed me to control how many points there are in the U direction and how many points there are in the V direction as well. So you've got that direction across here, which is one, and then the other one. So the more points you have going up here, the sharper it's going to be. But obviously I toned that down, so what it did is sort of generated these curves. So here, if I rebuild it with more, it's going to interpolate a different shape within it. So that's one way of actually getting like smooth shapes. Obviously from there, when we turn on our points, we can see these dotted lines. I'm just going to swap that back to shaded, and I'll just delete that. So we can do something like grab all of these points out here, and if we play around with that, it's going to start to deform our surface. So for those who are looking to try and get something natural looking, with some fabrics or whatever it may be. Obviously that doesn't look natural, but you get the idea that you can start to deform shapes. Like if we select all these, move them down slightly, it starts to look a lot more, well, less regular, less rigid, and more, yeah, I guess you could say natural. So, you know, it's like some weird towel or something like that. Doesn't really matter. So we've got this form. Let's just add in, I don't know, basic box. Go from the top, or was that the front? So the top here. Let's turn that to a shaded so I know what I'm doing. And looking on the side profile, I can just go there. Alright, so that's actually, oh, that's made it as a mesh. It doesn't really matter for this point, but you'd probably want to make it as a solid. We'll make the bottom one as a solid. Again, very rigid, don't worry about it. We're not doing this to make awesome designs at the moment, we're just doing it to get something we can work with. So if we go over to the solid tools, we can select a box and do the same thing from the bottom. I'm just going to make it a bit wider. And looking at the front, it's going to be that tall. And I'm just going to move it down somewhere there. It's going to clip into the bottom, but that's not really an issue at the moment anyway. Being a solid, what we can do with that is just simply fillet edge. So you type in fillet edge, click your edges, and press enter a bit, and it's going to start rounding stuff out. And we'll just do, let's see, does that calculate all the way around? It doesn't. Chain edges, radius 1. Okay, so it doesn't want to select the whole chain. That's okay, you can go around and pick all of it if it's a basic surface or solid. Okay, well, it still didn't like it, so you know what, it doesn't matter. Let's just go with that. Sometimes Rhino is a bit picky and weird, and like I said, I really need to update mine. You know what, I'll just delete that. Copy this one, paste it, bring it up to the top, and we can scale it using these square ones. So something like that. Oh. Drag it up, pull it back. Alright, so obviously this is the most perfect, amazing thing. What we can do here is we can apply the basic materials in Rhino. So what I'm just going to do is turn the points off on that. You can turn the points on and off with F10 and F11 when you have an object selected. So you select it, press F10, press F11, turns it off. So we select an object, we've got texture mapping, material. What we can do here is, it's kind of good to plan out your materials at this point. So even if it's just something really basic, like applying a specific color to something that's going to be red, right? So if this is going to be red, we can color it red. If this is going to be, if this is going to be like a specific type of fabric, we make that red. If we want this to be steel, we just change the material to, you know, we can make it a light gray or whatever, but then it looks exactly the same as everything else. So it's about getting the different colors on, because when we import this into Vred, it's not going to bring the materials we use. So we can use like all the amazing Rhino materials or V-Ray materials, but they're not going to come across to Vred. So what we want to do is somewhat assign color values and know what we're going to do. So you'll see what I mean in a minute. So I'm going to make this, anything that's this color, I'm going to make it like a rough aluminium. Anything down here, I'll try and make a fabric or a timber. I don't know, and the base can be something else. Another thing we want to do and think about is make sure you've got your surfaces thickened. So like here, this is impossibly thin and it obviously can't function in any way, as opposed to these which could be made out of solid things. So we can, I think the term is offset, and oh no, sorry, that's curve. So yeah, there's no thicken option in Rhino, is there? So we want to offset offset surface. So we can see that up here, we've got the option to offset the surface. We select the surface, press enter. It asks for a distance, and we want to make sure we're making it a solid. So we hit enter on that. It's going to calculate. Okay, so the distance to 2, my scales are really far off here. That's probably why those fillets didn't work earlier. Distance to 2 didn't work very well, so let's just go distance and go 0.5. And we'll go okay. And, you know, that's much better. It's still got issues, just because that's how it is. That's how something like this, you know, a weird curvy shape would work. But we can just roll with that for the moment. It's not really a big deal. Let's just bring that up. Nothing sticking out the bottom. Nope, all good. All right, so let's say we're super happy with this. It is the best thing we've ever designed, and we're going to try and render it out in Vred. What we want to do is export. We can export selected or export with origin. It doesn't really matter. If you hit export selected, just make sure to hit Control A or drag and select everything. So it says 3 poly surfaces. That's awesome. We can hit spacebar or enter at this point. It wants us to save it. I'm just going to use desktop and call this render test. And the options we've got is, this is where it starts to get it's obviously very important, but it's not very complicated. So we've got all the different Rhino versions and all these different things. Generally, what I find works really well is exporting as a step file. This is just one of those file types that's very common in 3D modeling. It is compatible with a lot of different programs. So a lot of times, if you're not sure if something will work, you can go with a step file. So render test step. You can have a look at the options, but, you know, whatever that means, doesn't matter. Just go okay. Hit save. And it opens those options again, but just hit OK. File successfully rendered or written, whatever, doesn't matter. So now we can get rid of Rhino, and we want to open up Vred. So when opening up Vred, it might look different to this screen. There is an option here for simple UI. I generally work without that, but we can have a look at going with the simple UI today. Simple UI is obviously meant for more of a beginner thing, but regardless of that, the program's still a bit complicated to get going. So let's just have a look. So first thing we want to do is actually import our creation. So we go open or import, and just go to our desktop, and we've got this render test step file. So I'm just going to click that. It opens up this, which is sort of importing menu. It might be different if you've got a different version, and you can see it knows it's a step. And we just want to make sure all of this is coming in. It doesn't really matter about the quality at the moment because we haven't made anything amazing. And we want to hit import. So that's going to take a couple seconds. Probably shouldn't take too long if it's just something very basic, but you can see just the conversion process. Usually it doesn't even take this long. There we go. All right, so now we've got our thing in here. Unfortunately, it didn't look like it copied across our materials, which kind of sucks because that's exactly why we did that. Okay, that's interesting. I'll have a look at that because I know there's some different import settings, but it's not the end of the world. So right now, you use your right mouse button to zoom in and out, left mouse button to move the camera rotated around. If you click and hold the middle mouse, you can pan. To actually select an object, you have to hold in Shift. And it's a good thing to turn on boundings because then it shows you what you have selected. Another useful tool to turn on is transform up here. and this allows you to move your file around in space. So if you hold in shift, you can click and drag it. So it's good that it keeps all the bodies separate. I think I just had one of the wrong material settings on when I imported it, but no big deal. Another important thing for moving around and navigating is using the control click command. So control click, and what that does is it changes your point of focus for the camera, because it always has one piece of the object in center. So if I want to look at something over here, it can be a bit awkward to try and zoom in on that correctly, as you can see. So what we want to do is we can just hit the home button. It tries to refocus everything. I think I've made this object really small, that's why I'm getting some issues. But we can use control and click there, and what that does is it allows us to focus in on individual little points that we've identified. So we want to have a close look at that. We can do that. Okay, so let's say we're really happy with this. It's all in the right spot. We want to have a look at our options on the left here. So this is essentially like our what's called a scene graph. It's where you control or select your files that you've imported and the environments that are in the scene. Lights you import or create within Vred also show up here. It doesn't really apply names to anything, so you can go through and rename them unless you actually have them named in Rhino. It should bring that information across. But generally, all you need to know is if you open up enough things, this is where the shapes are, where it creates them, or you could select the document tree, you could select that, you could grab and move one into the other, and that way you can control two at once. So it does have some pretty good options for just managing, which works very well, I think. Down here, if you've got the properties window open, it should be open on the simple UI. You can do things like scale the whole thing up. So maybe I'll just scale up. Let me do that. Make sure I'm selecting the right thing and just scale the whole thing up by about 10. All right, so just drag that up and that looks better. It looks like it's a better size based on the environment. And we can see it's floating a little bit above the ground. That doesn't matter. So we want to apply a material to this. If we go across to here, we can see we've got a default material, which is currently applied to everything. We can go to the plus here, and it gives us an option of creating all these different types of materials. So most of the time in Vred, what you want to do is create your own materials. So unicolor car paint, that just means it's going to be a nice shiny paint. So if we put it on there, obviously we can't see anything until we apply a color to it, but we can see that it's got a bit of shine to it. It'll probably look better if we apply it to the body. Yeah, so we can see that it's got some really cool gloss to it, which is nice. So that can work really well. Now let's say we want to create, like I said, I want to make a type of aluminium. The way that works is you select a chrome or a brushed metal, and you apply it like that. So you can see that's, coming out through there. And we get these options when we select our material for properties and everything like that. And we can select aluminium on that, and it renders it up in aluminium or gold or something. There's a lot of ways to do that. I tend to go to the more complex UI for adjusting materials. So we get this window, which allows us to play around with everything, right? So what we can do here is look at the contrast of it, the smear, which is used to say, let's go back to aluminium. The smear is how these edges blend together, whether it's like really sharp, like, sharp there, or it's a smooth transition. Contrast, obviously pretty self-explanatory. Roughness, so now the material's not as smooth or as reflective. But what's really interesting when playing around with Vred is it gives you the option to add a bump texture. And what we can do is use the structure to create a bump texture. And what a bump texture does is, well, it makes a surface bumpy. So if I just turn this number up, it's hard to see at the moment, but if I play around with the structure size, okay, so it started really big. What we want to do is bring our structure size really small. So like right now, you can see it's starting to apply a texture to it. Again, you got to have your scale set right in Rhino, otherwise it's not going to be very easy. But if I just go 0.01, we can see it's starting to look like a really rough, you know, a really rough surface. It's got like heaps of sharp highlights. If we turn the roughness off, it's like really reflective, but also bumpy. So there's like heaps of things you could do like that. Another cool option we've got is if we create a brush metal, it gives us the option of actually creating a brush pattern. But the thing is, it doesn't explain it. So hopefully you can follow along with this and you'll get an idea of how to go about doing some of these. Actually, you know what I'll do is we'll make a brush metal on this surface because it'll probably look really interesting. So right now it starts off completely basic. We want to go to what's called the brush orientation, and you can see it's got the size in one direction, the size in the other, and how it's mapped out. So right now there is essentially a pattern on there, it just hasn't been bumped up yet. So when we hit bump, we can talk about the intensity, and again, it starts to apply a type of pattern. The beautiful thing about this one is then when we start to play around with stretching it in one way or the other, we can see how that's going to start giving us like a really harsh brush texture. And you can go, you know, however you want with it. Tone down the bump intensity, and like we can start to get like a really soft brush. We can add roughness to it so it's not too shiny. All these kinds of things, right? So we can get a real you know, like a dark satin looking brush metal look. You can apply colors to it as well if you want, you know, go red, and get some really interesting textures going. So that's just one of the ways of using that. Other things we've got is metallic car paints. So this can be really cool for creating like an interesting shape. Again, scale is way off. I might actually just bump everything up a bit. So I'll just go back to the simple UI, go back to the scene graph, select everything. And the reason the scale's off, it might import, sometimes depending on what programs you use, sometimes it might import things at like, it might try and do millimeters instead of centimeters, or centimeters instead of millimeters. So it can be really confusing. So what we want to do is just see that things work. So I'm going to actually make this 100 times bigger than it was in Rhino. And some of this will look better. So again, just transform it, hold in shift, because you need to hold in shift when you select things. And there we go. Okay. So back to materials, just create a new metallic. And for some reason we're getting a weird glitch on these faces, but that's okay. I wouldn't worry about that. Sometimes you get weird glitches. They might disappear when we actually go to render it. They might not, but it doesn't really matter at the moment. In the simple UI, you actually do get some options for the metallic, which is really good. And the important one here is flake size. So the way a metallic paint works, it's one type of paint with some flakes in it. So we can make our base coat something like a red, and then we go to our flake color and we can make it like a yellow. And this is where you start to get these cool effects, like transitional colors and surfaces that you might see on like a car. You know, like you'll find every car generally has like a black base coat, or every black car, I mean, will have a black base coat, but there will actually be tints of flake throughout it. So like slight green flecks, and then when you zoom right in on a car, you can start to see the flecks and all this kind of stuff. Right now that doesn't really matter. We want our thing to transition from red to green because that's really cool for some reason. And you can play around with, you know, the roughness, the reflectivity, all these kinds of things. So I'm trying to get across the point is that you can just create whatever you want as a material. Of course, you can then just, you know, create a glass material and do that. And they generally work really well. You can play around with some of these settings. Transparencies, obviously, the color. So you can just easily tint it up to like a blue or something like that if you're trying to go for something which is more like a watery clear. You can play around with the roughness too. This kind of goes weird unless you're rendering it. Like right there, it just kills the transparency. But you can turn down the reflectivity or just crank it way up. So yeah, some of the things you can do. Anything else that's interesting? Okay, so one of the things that's actually quite interesting is what's called the woven cloth. Now, this works good, but it's very, very intensive on the processing power of your computer. The reason for that is if we apply it, what it does is it actually creates every single bit individually. So if I go with a nylon, you can even see it just takes time to calculate it. Yeah, like it looks like it wants to crash. It'll probably figure it out. Cool. And for some reason the scales are out of whack, so I'm going to put in a really small value. Maybe too small. Let's go 0.1. Okay, so we can see it's calculating each individual piece of fabric, like piece of yarn, whatever it is. Again, there's not a whole lot of options here, so if we turn off the simple UI, we can play around with all this kind of stuff. Twist angles, yarn, weaves and wefts, whatever they call them. Add bump to it. Like, you know, you can start to get some really interesting, soft-looking surfaces. Like, it might be a bit hard to see on the screen, but like I've worked in the bump mapping and all that. Again, the problem is it uses a lot of CPU power. So it might not be the best option in a lot of cases. And, you know, maybe we want to just play around with some of these settings to get something that looks more or less like a fabric you might be going with. So you can go twills, denim, satins, silk. I guess it's going to try and make a purple silk or something when it loads. Yeah, so, you know, like you can get some really cool stuff. Where's my menu gone? You can get some really cool, funky looking stuff. But if you actually go to statistics, it starts to slow down the screen quite a bit when it applies it and all that, whereas something like this just works super smooth, and especially when it comes to trying to get a ray traced render going or something like that. So there's options around that, and I'm going to go into that when we talk about creating custom materials from like an image or even a sketch or something we've created in Illustrator. But for now, there's also what we call the asset manager, which is essentially just a library of materials that we can work with. So if we come across here to assets down the bottom, it just opens up materials. This might be closed when you see it, Vred example assets. And it's got all of these things you can pick from, and you can open it up to break it down. So the leather ones, right? The way the leather works, again, don't worry about scale if it's wrong. Just come off the simple UI, open material, select leather. What you have to do here though is click modify, otherwise you can't change anything on it. And you just have to scale down the texture. The way to scale down a texture like this is to increase the amount of times it repeats, right? So again, like Rhino, we've got U and V directions, and we want to change the amount of time it repeats because that's how well it represents the scale. So if we change that 1 to a 10, we see it gets a lot smaller, and like right there, that's starting to look like a really nice sort of leather surface, even though, it's solid, there's problems like that. The beautiful part about this is it's not calculating the individual strands or anything like that. So it'll render up perfectly fine, and it won't give us any headaches. So again, we can just come to our simple UI, pick something else. We've got all these different types of plastics, and this can be good if you're looking for like an off-the-shelf kind of thing, like a basic red, or even some wood textures work. I wouldn't recommend them because I much prefer us to make our own, because what we can do is, in here you gotta go to the diffuse texture, what we can do is create our own based off types of timber we like. So if we really like a black heart sassafras or a Tassie oak or something like that, we can find examples of that in real life and actually make it work. There's also the option for rotating each side of the pattern, because it projects it in one way, another way, and from above as well. But we'll go over that in the more advanced texturing video down the line. Anyway, so let's say we're really happy with this, right? We think this is the best, this is great. We want to pull out a render of it. So we can either do it really basic and hit render, and it brings up our render options. So let's just say we go with the absolute default settings. The beauty of this is that it's going to render up really quickly, right? So let's just go smash out some weird numbers. That's going to render out really quickly, and if I can just see on my other screen where it's gone. Yeah, so it comes out really quick. The quality is quite low, all this kind of thing. So it's obviously not what we want. And it also renders with the background. So I generally tend to render without the background showing. You can turn it off by going through the setting over here. So yeah, with simple UI on, you can just open that up and hide it. Or if we go to, so let me just clean up all the ones we're not using. Where is it? Environments, Studio, you can just turn off visible, and that way it won't render it out. So that's probably the better way of doing it. But I mean, if both work, then both work. So we can go render. And with the simple UI, we get more simple render settings. I generally prefer the more complicated kind, but that's okay. So we can go 1920 by 1080, which is full HD, or we could actually go through and pick something, we can go 4K. One of the more important things is to make sure we export an alpha channel. So what that's going to do is, if there's nothing on the background, it's going to be transparent. So we go render. We make sure it's a PNG, because that's obviously what we want, because that can render transparencies. So PNG file type, I hit render, and that's just going to take a second to render out. Whenever that gets around to it, obviously the higher resolution you're going, the longer it's going to take to render. And there, all right, so it's rendered out. You can see like the transparency there and how it doesn't come through on the background, which is really cool. So that's one way of doing it. We can take it a level higher. Now we have to start playing around with settings in Vred to actually increase the quality of it now to make it look more realistic, because the resolution at this point is fine, but you know, like that's not too blurry or anything like that. In a folio, that would look perfectly fine. But, you know, there's no shadows, there's nothing like that. There's no shadow plane. Obviously, we don't want to worry about just like texture edges and roughness and all that. So we can turn on ray tracing, which is what calculates shadow and lighting, much like V-Ray. For ray tracing to work, you also have to turn on anti-alias. So what this does is it just runs a calculation of what it should look like properly. I don't know why it doesn't turn on by default, but it doesn't really matter. This does, however, hugely increase your render time. So what I'll do is drop the resolution of this down to... Yeah, okay, well, let's see how 1920 by 1080 goes. So I'll just hit render there. And we can see it's going to take a bit of a while on that. So what I'll do is I'll cancel that. I'll change the amount of samples it takes, which is how long it's going to take, because it'll calculate how many times it calculates the image to make sure it's got it right. So I'll just do that. And that should be quite a bit quicker. It's getting there. So what other things you can do is create a render queue, and then render out a bunch at once. So overnight, or go have dinner, go watch a show, render it out, and when you come back, you should have some good stuff. So hopefully this actually turns out well, but I'm going to show you one other method that's like a halfway between. So let's open that up, and we can see that's got some real nice detail going on in some areas of it. So we can put that one there, and doesn't matter what's there. Let's just open up that one too. So we can see the difference between them. You know, the one on the right here is capturing the color of the actual glass as it comes through. This one's just rendered it clear. We've got shading. We can see there's a bit of a ground shadow going on. It might be a bit hard to see in that, but it just adds a lot of detail. The reflections are punchier. So obviously there's two different levels of quality here. This is fine for showing shape, form, and ideas. This is what you use for a final render. But there is one more option we've got, and that involves sort of this thing that's pretty unique to Vred, which is called bake light and shadows. And what this does is it calculates where the light and shadow should be on this object, and it goes from there, and it tries to apply it to the surface so it doesn't have to calculate it every time. So we just want to make sure ambient occlusion is selected. We'll leave these on default, and we'll see what happens when we hit calculate. Alright, so that was really quick. I don't know if you could see that, but it applies shadows where they should be. So just under here, let's have a look. This should get a bit darker. Yeah, so it gets darker in bits that are underneath. We can punch up the quality. We can enable subdivisions and try it again. It takes a bit longer, does it a bit cleaner. So this is where things like ground shadow start to show up if you've got a lot of stuff going on. The bottom down here is darker. Something like this will be more clear when you've got lights in your scene. So, well, let's do that. Let's add some lights to the scene. All we have to do is just go scene, or we could go to lights here, and we just go create, and we can put in a point light, and let's put a light in down here. We can see this little thing down here. So if we hold in shift and try and click it, turn on transform, we can, oh, sorry, I've grabbed the ground floor. Let's go over to our scene graph, make sure we've got our point light selected, hold in shift. All right, so now it's starting to throw out a shadow. Sometimes it glitches out with the outside. Let's not worry about that now because it doesn't know where to calculate all the shadows and because we've got a transparency going on. So what we can do is calculate that. Okay, so that's glitching up. I don't know why it's doing that. If I turn on ray tracing, oh, there's something going on with the shadow plane. I can't really explain why that's doing that. So we can have a look at some of our light settings. What do we got? Well, just about nothing there. So we can go, maybe it's too intense. Maybe it needs to chill out a bit. It's still casting the very strong shadow, so we can have a look at some of the more complicated options. It might just be easier to go to scene and light editor. Alright, so here we've got options, so we can, okay, cast on shadow material. A lot of the time you want to turn that off because it just glitches out when it tries to cast it onto the basic default shadow plane. It's more of a complicated, it's like a whole other system to implement all that. So turning the light on and off doesn't make a huge difference until maybe we make it really bright. Yeah, so you can see it's applying it to the top. You can add color to, I think we talked about this in the class, of giving off that sort of warm feeling. I'll just turn off ray tracing for a second. So yeah, it still looks like it's weirdly glitching out on the surfaces. Let's have a look to see if this will calculate properly. There's a good chance it might not. Okay, so we can just hide the shadow plane for now if we're doing that. And okay, so there's an issue with how this surface was imported. We saw it with the side glitches before, but that doesn't really matter. We can see down here, it's actually calculating some of the shadows from there. So sometimes it doesn't always work out, but in this case, we could just keep anti-aliasing on, throw out another render, because I've turned off the environment, it's gone really dark. So leave that on, and you can start to affect the mood. What we're going to look at after this is creating our own custom materials, so building them up from scratch, detailing surfaces and things in Rhino so we can get more advanced surfaces going where we can apply materials really well and in interesting ways. We can start to look at animations, all these other kind of things. I think that's plenty for now. So it'd be really great to see some of you trying to put things together. I mean, it's all a learning process, especially, even for me. I haven't used Rhino a whole lot in my workflows, especially for Vred. So we're going to be learning a lot of stuff as we go through. We might find that some of these surfaces have to be recalculated in Rhino before we export them, or you know, all these other kind of weird things, because Vred does have a lot of options when it comes to fixing surfaces up and converting them. Maybe we've got to play around with some import settings, who knows. You know, maybe I just broke it, but we'll all go through it together. What I'd really like to see from you all is at least an attempt. Do something in Rhino, bring it across to Fusion, bring it across to Vred, sorry, and apply some different materials. See what it looks like when you do a render normally, see what it looks like when you do one with ray tracing turned on. Try and bake the shadows in. I'll make a video that has a really good example of that, because there is some really good ways of using it. Yeah, and then if you come across these issues, just work with them, screenshot them, put them in the folio, talk about it, because it's all a learning process. And you'll find that, this issue meant I couldn't render it using the regular way, but because I've had enough experience with it, I know that turning on ray tracing and anti-aliasing means I can still get a good render out. So a lot of the time it's not about the program working perfectly or everything coming together perfectly. It's about what can we do to get the result we need. And right now the result I needed was a nice render, and regardless of the problems, we're still able to get that. Have a crack at that. I would like to see everyone try to use Vred, because it is going to be a lot easier when we get into things like animations. Chuck it into your folios, you update it, put maybe like a large high resolution render in that Google Drive folder so I can provide some feedback on it. That should be good. We've got class tomorrow being Monday, so if you see this today, I don't expect you to have any of it done. That's okay. But yeah, as the week goes on, just add some stuff to your folio online. Cool. Thank you.